Rev up your engines! Today I'm going to give you the ultimate answer of why it's bad to let your car idle a lot. Now, cars are made to drive you down the road. So they're designed to be moving, to have airflow over the engine and transmission. They're not designed to just sit there like, say, the air conditioner in your house. It just sits there and cools the house. Now, of course, it's not going to instantly destroy your car. If you sit there for 10-15 minutes at a railroad track, idling, especially if it's a newer vehicle, it's more insidious. It can damage things over time. The other year in Danville, Virginia, they found out that they had $16,000 of damage to the police cars that they had to fix because they were sitting there idling and the plastic parts were starting to melt and break. Realize plastic is not that good with heat. And I know that for a fact because take BMW that makes really crappy plastic parts. Here in Houston where it's hot, they crack like mad. I see them where the intakes crack. Everything cracks from heat. And of course, if you have a vehicle that's an older vehicle and things are starting to go bad anyways, you're stressing the cooling system, the transmission, the engine, by sitting there and idling for a really long time. You notice if you see police at events, they'll often open their hood a little to leave vents so the heat can escape better. Because when you're driving down the road, all that heat of the engine just doesn't sit there and build up. Air is blowing through the radiator. It's blowing it back through. It's cooling it, exiting under the car. If you just sit there and idle for long lengths of time, especially if you have your car in drive, if it's an automatic, that's straining the transmission. It's now engaged because it's in drive. That starts to get hot, and guess how the transmission gets cool? Now, the transmission down here is somewhat cooled by air going over it as you're moving, but mainly there's cooler lines. And where do they go? They go to the bottom of the radiator, and there's a chamber in the bottom of the radiator. That's the transmission cooler. Transmission fluid goes through it and it uses the radiator to cool it down. Now you might think, hey, the radiator gets hot. Well, transmission fluid gets a lot hotter than the radiator fluid that has fans blowing air, so that helps to cool it. And if you're just sitting there with your car in drive, stop for 15 minutes or something like that, all that heat's going to build up more. It's going to strain your cooling system. So if you do have to idle, put it in neutral. Because if you put it in neutral, then the transmission isn't in drive and engaged, and it builds up much less heat that way. Make sure your cooling fans are working correctly. Start the car and turn the AC on full blast. Then go to the cooling fans. Make sure they're spinning. That one's spinning and that one's spinning. Because let's say one fan's working and one isn't, it's going to make it overheat over time, especially when it's idling. And recently, I read in Minneapolis, they made a law that they can't even make any more drive-through business. They can't build any new ones. Restaurants, banks, whatever. They're not allowing any new drive-ins to be made because they did a study and found out how long people were letting these things idle and how much fuel was being wasted and the air is being polluted. Most people want their cars to be around a long time. So it isn't a good idea to let them sit and idle. It's just not. Now, I know people are probably going to call me out and say, Scotty, you're a hypocrite. You probably let them idle all the time while you're working on them. Well, yes, I do, but I also have this. My Big Air fan. Literally, it's called Big Air. I stick it in front of the car, turn it on full blast. Now, if you see guys working on cars, letting them idle a long time, and they don't put a giant fan in front of it, hey, they're not good mechanics. It's keeping the engine cool. Plus, it's also blowing all the noxious vapors downstream so I don't have to breathe them in. Now realize the number one damage causer in your car is heat. Whether it be heat from the engine, heat from the transmission, getting hotter as it's spinning there, just sitting there idling, but it's in drive. Like I said, if you put it in neutral or park, that's going to get rid of some of the heat the transmission's putting out at least. I realize that modern cars have very high pressure cooling system. When I was a young mechanic, they had low pressure. Some of them only had 5 psi. They had giant radiators, and they didn't need a high pressure because the radiators were so big they could dissipate the heat with lower pressure. But today, some cars have 25 psi pressure cooling system. The higher the pressure, the more strain on the systems. As it ages, and things start to either leak or springs wear and the cap doesn't hold the pressure right. You don't want to stress a system like that sitting for 20 minutes with your car idling in drive, especially here in Houston where, hey, it was 105 days in a row this summer. I mean, let's face it, if you're driving a standard transmission and you're sitting there waiting, you don't push down the clutch and put it in first gear and leave it with all that strain pushing on it. Put it in neutral, take your foot off the clutch. Then you put in the clutch and put it in. So at least put your car in neutral or park if you're planning on sitting for a long time and you just have to have that car running. Now, let's say you live up north and it's freezing winter. Well, then letting it idle isn't really going to hurt anything. If it's so cold outside, that cold is going to dissipate any of the heat you create. But even in the summer, I've been in Wisconsin when it was 99 degrees. It can get hot there too. So you don't want to strain a car in hot weather by idling it and drive for extended periods of time. Because I've had customers with really old cars, and when they let them idle too long, they bring them in here. I could see the catalytic converters. They were actually glowing red. It got so hot that they were glowing red. The metal got red hot. Because let's say you got an older car. The catalytic converter's purpose is to burn onboard hydrocarbons, and it does that by burning them up and getting real hot. Your engine's old and it puts out a lot of hydrocarbons and it's burning it up. It's going to get so hot that it can get red hot. I've seen that. And of course, that's dangerous. So you got a really old car, hey, my advice, shut the thing off if you're going to be sitting there for 5, 10, 15 minutes. Don't let it sit there idling. Because if the cats get that hot, hey, I've seen them start grass fires, especially if you're out in the country. Those things get so hot, it'll start the grass on fire. That's one of the reasons they put those heat shields on them originally, to cover them all up. But a lot of the modern ones don't have such big heat shields because it's too cumbersome. There's no space for them. So they get hot, and if something gets in there and it starts a fire, just because you're sitting there idling too long. And that was one of the original problems of catalytic converters when they first came out. They were finding that they're going through the national forest and stuff, and they could start fires because they were just getting too hot. They hadn't had them perfected yet. They didn't have the materials perfected, and they ran way too hot, and the original ones didn't have any heat shields on them at all, and they often did start fires. Now, odds are you're not going to start a fire just sitting there idling, but you do wear your transmission and engine out prematurely, and the catalytic converter. You could spend all that money to fix something that wouldn't have happened if you would have just shut the engine off. I remember a customer of mine years ago. She towed her car, and I said, well, you blew your engine to shot. What happened? She said, well, it was overheating when I was on a highway, but, you know, it was a big traffic jam, and I was only 15 minutes from home, so I just kept driving it, but then it got into the H, and then it stopped running. Well, it's not that direct, just idling, but over time, it can do the same kind of damage if you do it all the time. So do your car a favor, and don't sit idling it for extended periods of time. Unless, of course, you have an electric car. Then it doesn't matter, because when you're sitting there, the motor isn't doing anything. The only thing that's working would be the electric air conditioner that runs off the battery, and that's cooling you off, but it's made to do that. Scotty just gave you a good reason for buying an electric car, something I normally don't do. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.